Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome to another one of Newton for Everyone's series of educational events. I'm Luke O'Halloran. I'm on the steering committee here at Newton for Everyone. And so, yeah, thanks for showing up here, and also to the folks joining on the Zoom. Particularly happy to see some of our elected officials with us tonight. Councilors Lipoff, Lebovitz, Leary, and Laredo. Thanks for coming, guys. We are here tonight. We here at Newton for Everyone are putting on this event because we believe that the housing crisis affects people, of course, at all ages and walks of life. It affects kids who might have to move from one school to another if their parents get priced out of the neighborhood that they're living in. It might affect a family who might hesitate or choose not to have as many kids as they might like if they can't afford the housing that they feel would let them do that. It affects working people hesitating to take a new job if they're not sure they can make their housing affordable for them in another community. And it, of course, and what we'll be talking about tonight, it affects older adults going through their own transitions. And when I think about that last group, I think about my in-laws, my mother and father-in-law, who are currently putting my 3 and 5-year-old to bed. My wife's traveling for work tonight, and so they were able to help out. I served them some of my finest Annie's mac and cheese, and now hopefully they're working their way through Goodnight Moon. And I just feel so lucky. Sorry? Again, yes. Well, you know, you try to pull something different from it every time. Keep the material alive. I feel so grateful that they're such a seamless part of our lives. And that's really because they live here in Newton with us. They live over in Newton Highlands. My wife and I and our kids, we live here in West Newton, just on the other side of the Pike. And you know, them living in this community with us, it does not only mean free babysitting. It also means that they can pop over for impromptu play dates, come to all of our birthday parties, and just be a part of the richness of our family, and I feel so fortunate about that. And they live over there in the Highlands in a big old Victorian, the kind that's common over there, and they're not sure how long that house is going to make sense for them. And if they move, they really want to stay with and maintain the rich lives that they have here in this community. You know, my mother-in-law's soccer league and knitting group, the way that my father-in-law is on a first-name basis with all the waitresses at the diners in a 5-mile radius. They don't want to lose that stuff as they move to a different form of housing at some point in the future. And that sort of potential challenge is what we're going to be talking about here tonight. And fortunately, we have the perfect guests, both residents of Newton, with us to discuss this. We have Jen Molinsky, who directs the Housing and Aging Society program at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. She is also formerly on staff at the city in the planning department. And also we'll be hearing, presenting with her will be Lizbeth Heyer, who's the president of Two Life Communities, which is a provider of affordable integrated senior housing. And Lizbeth also serves on the Newton Housing Partnership. So you guys can come up here and take it away.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. We so appreciate the opportunity to collaborate on this really important conversation. It's a complex one, and we want to leave maximum time for questions and discussion because we really want this to provide the information that you want, both as activists and people who lean into thinking about affordable housing and taking action on housing in Newton, but also individuals who might be seeking information about how to navigate what is a complicated process of putting together everything that it takes to age well. And so I think you'll hear a lot of themes from us around choice and dignity and connection, and in particular, how we think about those things in the context of housing and housing options, and housing affordability, which again is a really complicated conversation because affordability in the senior space is really different than it is in the family space because of what it takes to age and what happens when you retire. and your economics change. So what we're going to talk about tonight is, what do we mean by senior housing, and in particular supportive housing? We're going to talk a little bit about why we as a community need to think about this and care about this topic. Focus on, if we don't take action, what are the threats that individuals and communities face, given in particular the changing demographics and economics of older adults? And then we'll spend a little bit of time surveying the options and end with just some of mine and Jen's thoughts on where can we go with this? What are some things we can do locally to act, and what are some of the policies that we can lean into? So with that, and I'll also say this is a lot, and we're going to try to talk for just 30 minutes. It's sort of like a high-level overview to wet your whistle on the topics, because then we can use the conversation to dive deeper if there's things that are of particular interest as we talk. So we apologize if we throw too much at you, but hold your questions, and we'll look forward to a really rich conversation.
Thanks, Lizbeth. It's really wonderful to be here. It's so nice to see all of you, and to do this with Lizbeth is a real treat. Is my mic on? Okay, how's that? Much better. Okay, thank you. So we know that quality housing is critical for people of all ages. There's no question about that. But there's some ways that housing plays a unique role in the lives of older adults. And when I use that term, when Lizbeth uses that term tonight, we're generally talking about 65 and over. So housing costs and stability are key to economic security in later life, which is a time when households often have fixed or declining incomes, as well as growing needs for supports and services. So affordability challenges can increase in later life. When older adults are unaffordably housed, we know our research has shown that they cut back on things like food, out-of-pocket medical care, prescriptions, co-pays, and they may forego the services that they really need to remain in their home. Because physical challenges increase with age, and because older adults spend the majority of their time at home, the attributes of the physical house are also really important and critical in allowing people to perform activities of daily living. Housing can be enabling or disabling, right? If you have a house that fits your needs, you can do more for yourself and no need to rely less on other people to do things like laundry or cooking for you if you can navigate your own house to do that. Challenges with independent living and self-care also increase with age, with many people needing assistance in their homes. And to Elizabeth and to me, this is a housing issue. This will be a big theme tonight, the idea that we need not just the house, but the services and supports to remain in that house, that both of those are housing issues. Of course, housing's location matters to people's capacity to navigate their communities, to take advantage of social opportunities and to engage in the community. And housing is also home, right? We don't want to forget that. Whenever we talk about housing and housing units, I'm very mindful of the fact that we want to bring it back to home and all that means and all that implies: comfort, familiarity, memories of family, associations with family, and all of that. Let's see. So we've got some serious housing challenges facing America's older adults. And the slide here is at a national level. We've got a record number of older adults who are unaffordably housed. That's a third of older households are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. Half of those are paying more than half their income for housing across the country. Here in the Boston area, almost half of older owners and 57% of older renters are in this boat. They're cost burdened. And cost burdens are higher among people in their 80s and over because of that fixed or declining income, and yet costs can be stable or even rise. Rents may easily outpace Social Security cost of living increases, for example. And there are a few causes for this affordability crisis that we can get into. Wages have not kept up with housing costs over the past decades, and we're undersupplying housing, which puts pressure on those prices. An added complexity for older homeowners is that more of us homeowners are carrying mortgages into later life. So 3 decades ago, 3% of owners 80 and over had a mortgage on their home. It is now 31%. So that's a really significant change, and it means that though owners have some equity to lean on, there's no question about that, and we can talk about how people are getting equity out of their house to support themselves in older age, that additional debt is a significant issue. Accessibility, as I mentioned, is very important. 22% of older adults report a mobility difficulty that can make it hard to get into, navigate, and use various features of the house. But our estimate, and this is probably generous, is that just 4% of housing stock in the U.S. has basic accessibility features. Less than 1% is actually wheelchair accessible. And the Northeast is the worst of all. So anything that I just said, it's worse here because of our older housing stock. Lastly, and I'll touch on this next, it's not just that affordable, physically adequate home that's important, it's also whether you can afford the supports and services needed to stay in that home. And the spoiler alert here is that very few households can. An estimated 70% of older adults reaching the age of 65 will need some kind of long-term care services. This can be help with things like shopping and cooking and doing laundry and keeping home and managing medication. And it can also be personal care assistance, bathing, dressing, and the like. The average is that group that needs that care, 70%, will need it for an average of 3 years. Medicare does not cover these costs. Medicaid, for households who qualify, might cover some of these costs in the home. Medicaid covers mostly long-term care in a nursing home. And Massachusetts has programs that help with this, but you have to be able to qualify for Medicaid to get to them. As a result, many people are relying on family, and many people report unmet needs. One can purchase care in the private market, but this is expensive. A home health aide in the Boston area costs an average of $39 an hour. Care must typically be purchased in 3 to 4 hour increments. So you're talking about quite an expense on top of your housing costs, on top of food and all of that. We have a shortage of healthcare workers exacerbated by COVID, and so that's another issue. So as a result of the cost of care and the cost of housing, our analysis has shown that only 10% of people who live alone or 75 or over in the Boston area can afford a daily visit from a caregiver on top of housing and using only their income. Only 7% can afford assisted living. So again, tapping equity, we can talk about that. It's not going to work for everybody. It will work for some people. Now, if I can advance the slide. And now I will turn back to Elizabeth.
Okay, so just a few more data points. Am I on now? Hello? Oh, no. Now I'm on. Ooh, don't talk so loud. A few more data points before we get into the specifics on impacts in Newton and housing choices. So the aging population is of great demographic concern. The number of households who are 80 and over from the aging of the baby boom generation is the single largest growing demographic in our country. And as a matter of fact, from 1980 up through 2040, the number of households 80 and over will double. And it's also particularly important to underscore that those households primarily will be headed by older adults. So these are people, when we talk about isolation and loneliness, which we'll get into in a minute more, that's what we're talking about, people who are head of households primarily living alone in an apartment or a single family home. So going to the next slide, again, just to underscore some of the economics here, bringing the economics back to Massachusetts, the Gerontology Institute at UMass says that 57% of single older adults cannot afford the basic cost to age in this state, and that's also true for 20% of couples. That's over 300,000 households in our state who are over 62 that can't afford the basic cost of living, and it's not surprising because of that UMass says that Massachusetts has the highest rate of economic insecurity among older adults than any other state in this country. In addition, CHAPA a couple years ago did a really important study to look at the entire population in Massachusetts that was underserved or unserved by subsidized housing of any form, be it living in a subsidized community, having a Section 8, having an MRVP. And they identified about 500,000 people who are unserved by subsidies that are eligible, and of those, 51% were older adults. So again, a really dramatic demographic. And Just to put a couple specific numbers on this, the median income of older adults in our state is $29,000 a year. And that UMass study says the minimum you need to age and afford just the basics of aging in Massachusetts is about double that, about $60,000. The median Social Security income is about $19,000 a year, and that makes up the vast majority of older adults who are retiring, but retiring without assets or retiring with a mortgage that they probably obligated to send their kids to college or pay for healthcare costs or other things. And the max Social Security benefit you can get is about $40,000 a year. So even if you're maxing out on your Social Security and you had that, work the maximum number of years and had the highest income, you're still going to be $20,000 short of what it takes just to age with the basic needs covered in Massachusetts. So let's talk for a minute about loneliness and isolation. Remember, most older adults age alone as a single head of household. And it's been proven through numerous studies that isolation and loneliness causes increased dementia. The rate actually increases of the number of people who have dementia, but also the rate at which dementia worsens. It's accelerated through loneliness. Older adults who are lonely have a dramatic increased risk of stroke and also of heart attack. And we know through studies that Jennifer's done, through, as we mentioned, I work at Two Life Communities. We house older adults, so we also know our own data. And we know that nationally, people who age in senior housing typically leave senior housing that doesn't have supports and social engagement at the age of about 79 or 80. They're moving to a higher level of care. We know in Massachusetts that's around 81, and at Two Life, the average age that people leave us is around 89, 88 or 89. At any given time, 30 to 40% of people who live with us could be in a nursing home, but because of all the supports, we're able to keep all but 2% a year living in our housing rather than going to another place. So the social connections that you can get from housing together with the supports keeps people living longer, which improves health and improves wellness, which is a key part of aging well. And then just to bring it home even further, not only are we the most economically insecure state to age in, but we also place more older adults in nursing homes per capita than every other state in this country. And I think Jennifer and I both agree, it's because of our combined high cost of housing and care. It's not because our older adults are more frail. It's because they can't afford their housing. And if they can barely afford their housing by foregoing medicine or healthy nutrition or other kinds of supports, when they start needing home care, the only place to go where Medicaid will support you if you're not Medicaid eligible, which you have to be very poor, is to go to a nursing home. So people are going there for economic reasons. They're not going there because that's where they need to go to get care. We can do this better. And the question tonight is, how do we do this better? How do we as a community prevent these massive expenditures on the Medicaid side, which have gone up dramatically as housing costs and the demographic of older adults has risen?
Okay, so before I move to the next slide, before we get to the hopeful part of this presentation, which we do promise is coming, just to recap. So we have a growing population of people, especially in their 80s, and this is a time of life when housing affordability challenges grow and also those needs for supports and services grow, and for the accessibility and for help maintaining a home and all of that. So for some people, remaining in a long-time single-family home in the community is their preferred choice, and some households may be able to afford the services they need to do so. Many would prefer an alternative, actually, that would give them more of these services, more of these connections to other people, to community, but they are stuck in place because there aren't any real alternatives to single-family homes in their community, or because their resources won't allow them to purchase what exists. So this is very much a story that we hear in Newton. People want to downsize, they want to sell their single-family home and maybe purchase a condo, but the money that they can take from their single-family home may not be enough to cover the cost of a condo that is more centrally located, that has accessibility features and all the like. And so, what we hear in Newton, people want to downsize, they want to sell their single-family home and maybe purchase a condo, but the money that they can take from their single-family home may not be enough to cover the cost of a condo that is more centrally located, that has accessibility features and all the like. This is a first issue I think that we need to talk about, which is more housing options for older adults to be able to find what they need right here in our city. So we'll talk about what this might look like in a moment, but I'm thinking apartments, I'm thinking condos and around our villages. We're thinking even small scale, so-called missing middle housing that can offer a greater concentration of homes that can potentially also create some efficiencies for that service delivery. So what do we lose if we don't act? For one, our housing system gets stuck. Sorry, this is very sensitive. I'm going to put it down. Our housing system gets stuck, right? If older adults want to move but can't, then younger families have a harder time moving in. And right now we have the higher challenge, the additional challenge of higher interest rates that has made this stickiness of the housing market even more complicated. But baby boomers own a third of all U.S. households. They make up a third of all U.S. households, and they have a very high home ownership rate. So without more options for them to move into or new housing for millennials and Gen Zers to come to and start families, this is a problem. We may also lose our older residents who must move on, who need more levels of care or need services they can't afford, and they can't find it in our community. And so they're looking outside of Newton, they're looking outside of the region, which is something that then disconnects them from services, from family, from friends, from places of worship. And then I think we all lose. For individuals, remaining in unsuitable housing can be costly, particularly if inaccessibility leads to falls or to reliance on someone else for tasks that you could do yourself if you had a more enabling house. And for families, this can mean more is placed on them. And for this society, this can mean higher healthcare costs. At the end of the day, the government program that will pay for long-term care is Medicaid and in nursing homes, right? And so it is generally costlier for taxpayers to do that, regardless of the larger issue of people don't want to do that. And it can also involve spending down one's wealth to do so. So we see our recommendations really falling into two buckets, one on the housing side and one on the care side. But we'll go back to Lizbeth.
Yeah, can we go back to one
Sorry.
slide?
Oh my gosh, I keep doing that. So
That's
sorry.
okay. So we want to talk for a minute about what the options are. And before I start describing these different options, I want to set the context a little bit to bring back into the room the concepts of choice and dignity and connection and affordability. There is no one right choice. The key is being educated. The key is knowing what it is that you're seeking and marrying that concept of what it is you're seeking with what actually you can afford and what's sustainable for you. And there's multiple ways to do that. And what I would like to put out there is that as a society, we're a bootstraps, go it alone, success is, you carried me out of my house. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you choose. But we have, I think, framed the concept of senior communities or senior living in the wrong way, where people think it's a failure if they have to leave their home and move into community. And we really want to change that concept and frame it as choosing community, choosing to share your life with others in your older years is success. It's a beautiful thing, and it's also a platform that can help address some of the other economics that go along with housing on the care side. Because as Jennifer mentioned, paying for care at home alone is extraordinarily expensive. If you just need 1 hour of help a day, you're paying a minimum of 4 to get someone to show up, and that costs, if you multiply it over the number of days in a year, it gets upwards of $40,000, $50,000 a year, which can be the entirety of somebody's income. So what ends up happening is people put their head in the sand and they just hope that's not going to be them. And they hope that they can scrape by in their current housing situation. And we really want to change that by engaging with community about how we create a range of options that give people that opportunity for dignity and choice and joy and connection and affordability. So within the world of senior housing, as Jennifer mentioned, there is the issue of adapting a single-family home where you are, and there are home modification loan programs that can do that. What you don't get with that is the opportunity to leverage the efficiencies on the care side and to do some cost sharing that can come from more innovative care models in a senior living community. For the extremely low-income folks, there is elderly public housing. Newton has a number of communities statewide. We have about 60,000 public housing units across the state, and actually about 30, it's the biggest stock of affordable housing in the state. Another panel, I would love to come back for that one. But of those, the vast, vast majority are actually elderly public housing. So there's quite a bit of elderly public housing, but we underfund it, and we don't worry about the care side. So the Newton Housing Authority is struggling without enough resources to bring the services and supports into the housing, to marry housing with care. There's independent living, which is 62 plus typically, sometimes they're 55 plus communities. That's what Two Life does. And in independent living, it's not a regulated form of senior housing with embedded healthcare in the model, but as an independent living provider, you can innovate and bring in partners and do a lot with programming that can marry the housing with a lot of innovations on social interaction and social programming with care. There's assisted living, which is, actually, I'm going to go to CCRCs first because assisted living is easier to describe. There's continuing care retirement communities, which is that phased model where when you move into what's called independent living. It's an apartment with a full kitchen and bath in a multifamily community on that same campus. Then you move when you start needing care and you can't be in independent living on your own to assisted living. And assisted living is that midpoint between an independent living and a nursing home. And assisted living, you give up your kitchen. It's typically you get like a hot plate and maybe a little refrigerator. You do have a private bathroom, but you pay for your housing in that smaller, efficient apartment. And the statutory requirement is that there is care available to you in assisted living. So each model of assisted living is entirely different. The only requirement is that care is available and coordinated, but sometimes the cost of that home care is embedded in the contract price for the rent, and sometimes you have to pay privately. When it is embedded, it's typically just an hour. And so what happens is when you start needing more than that hour of care, if you're in a CCRC, they're gonna, in the contract, force you to move to their nursing home. So you 3 times when you move in, you're moving from independent to assisted, then from assisted to nursing home, and you become increasingly isolated from the more engaged and vibrant community as you move up that ladder. So I did describe assisted living. Sometimes there's just standalone assisted living, where you just go right there and it's not connected to independent or CCRC. But again, you have to really pay attention to that contract because you think you're getting a lot of care, but you're not, and they're very, very expensive. And typically, how you purchase that care is controlled by the operator, which can also drive up costs. There's ADUs, which we all know a lot about. We advocated, we were one of the flagship communities that made that possible, and now there's a new state law that makes that possible. That's a really nice option where you can connect family or community with an accessory dwelling unit on site. It creates that connection to family. What it doesn't do is get you that efficiency of care that you can get by buying care collectively in a community. And then there's age-inclusive communities, which tend to be apartment buildings that have the physical spaces that will accommodate individuals and families, and they're called age-inclusive because those one-bedroom apartments are an opportunity for older adults to move into a community where there are also families living. And I would say there, the benefit is you're getting that opportunity for connection, but I would also say you have to really pay attention to whether that opportunity is curated, because you can be just as lonely living in an apartment in a multifamily building if someone isn't intentionally making sure that those social connections happen, and that families get busy and they're doing school and homework and kids, and you really need to curate and create opportunity for that intergenerational exchange. And also in a community like that, if the operator is not paying attention to the care needs of the older adults, you're still going to be on your own to buy that care, and it's going to be just as expensive as if you're in your own home or another apartment building, because no one's organizing those consolidated or innovative care contracts. And then we also wanted to just throw out, there's a couple of creative options that are out there. There's co-housing, where the housing is developed and sort of operated by the people who live there, and there can be senior housing co-housing communities where it's in an apartment building or small houses surrounding central community buildings, and in that case, people are working together to achieve those connections, the affordability, and the care. There's intentional intergenerational communities. Two Life is working on a really interesting one in Mattapan right now, where it's going to be 68 apartments, 48 for older adults, it's all affordable, 48 for older adults, 12 for large families who are adopting kids out of foster care, and 8 for youth who are aging out without permanent families, and that's going to be a very intentionally organized age-inclusive community where the older adults can be grandparents and the families can help also care for the older adults. So it's a really interesting way to curate those kind of intergenerational exchanges. And then Two Life is also working on Opus, which is a middle market community right here in Newton. I don't want to talk a whole lot about it, but it's really aimed at the barbell, which I'm going to get into in a minute, where there's options for you if you're really, really poor or really, really wealthy, but the economics of how this all works doesn't work for the vast majority of people. So Two Life has been really working hard on innovating, on using the sort of share buying economy to use economies of scale of people living together to make that care and make that housing work for people who otherwise couldn't afford those high-priced options. So that's just sort of a quick scan of a lot of stuff that's available, and I guess I just can't underscore enough. Educate yourself and learn what the model is, because they're all different, and the rules in the CCRCs and the assisted livings in particular are all different, and you really have to read that contract. So this next slide is the visual of the barbell. Green is affordability of housing and affordability of care, and orange is the housing's kind of affordable and the care is not, and yellow is a little more affordable on the housing and the care is not. So again, if you're really, really poor, and Jen talked about this, if you're Medicaid, duly eligible, Medicaid and Medicare, meaning you're earning less than about $13,000 a year, and you have less than $2,000 in assets, you can qualify for public housing or subsidized housing and obtain they're called long-term services and supports, or those home care, through Medicaid subsidies. And so Two Life, the vast majority of people who live with us right now, because we have almost all Section 8 in our housing, our median income is about $13,000 a year. So we totally know how to do this well with people who are very poor by leveraging those Medicaid supports. And then all the way at the upper end, if you're over, we would say about 150% of median, chances are you're going to have enough income and assets to afford your housing and care. And it's everybody in that in-between space that in some way is challenged by housing and by care. So for folks who are low income, that are kind of over that Medicaid eligible, but still in that world of qualifying for housing supports, they can get housing through a subsidy program, but the subsidies on the housing side require a higher income because we don't deeply subsidize housing enough. It's really for people who are in that 60% or 80% of median space, not that extremely low income space. So we're moving a lot of people into housing where the rent is about $1,800 a month. For a low-income housing tax credit apartment, for an individual, it's $1,800 a month. That is not affordable to the vast majority of older adults, simply as a rent, let alone when they start needing care and they're not going to be Medicaid eligible. So we've really got to lean into our housing policy and how we're directing our subsidies in a way where they're meeting where the vast majority of need is for older adults. We're just not there right now. And then for the middle, we have housing in yellow because those are the folks who may be in an apartment or they may be in their single family home, and they're the ones that have their heads down and hope they're the ones that don't need the home care, that they're not going to fall into that really expensive trap where they're forced to leave their housing because they can't afford to age there with their care needs. So we've really got to come up with those creative solutions and giving people options that really respect dignity and give real choice, and really to be a place where they want to be.
And I just want to add one small nuance here, which is that for extremely low income, these programs exist, but they are not entitlements, right? So we only serve about 36% of older adults who qualify for that housing, for instance. So our low income population theoretically has these options, and 2 Life is a wonderful option, but your waiting lists are how long?
8,000 people
So
on our wait list. It's about 5 to 8 years to get in, depending on which community you apply for.
Right. So housing assistance is not like Medicare where you automatically, are eligible or qualify, you can receive it. This is you qualify, but you're then on a waiting list for the most part. So here's the good news. I want to start by acknowledging that we in Newton are really lucky. We have the wonderful, I think the bones of a really great city for aging. We've got incredible village centers. We don't have one downtown. We have many village centers that are walkable. We've got transit access. We've got great parks and recreational opportunities. We are here in the hub of arguably one of the best healthcare locations in the entire world. We have access to services. We've got a great organization in Newton at Home, which is an organization that is designed to support older adults who are living and aging in Newton with the recreation and engagement and home repair help that they need. We've got New Cal, which is on the way, which will be a great new resource. So we're doing so much well here that I think it's just a moment to take stock of that and to realize that the things that we need to address are the housing piece and the care cost piece. We can't do all of these alone, obviously. A lot of this is beyond the scope of Newton, but we can advocate for different policies. So we have recommendations that are really in 2 buckets. One is what can we do here about housing? And the second is where can we put our advocacy at the state and federal levels to sort of to push for some of the programmatic changes that would really make a difference. So on the housing supply side, we have these village centers that we can leverage, adding housing that not only serves older residents, whether it be in dedicated senior housing or in mixed age buildings that can have some of the, we can think about creative ways to bring those intentional connections and to make an efficiency of scale so that we can provide services that would add a lot of traffic to our local businesses, that would enliven our village centers. We can ensure that we're doing all we can regarding inclusionary zoning so that we're sure we're creating a mix of incomes in our apartments. Other communities have explicitly middle income inclusionary zoning, and I would say that middle income challenges that Lizbeth just showed are not unique to Newton. This is nationwide. People are thinking about this. How can we provide the support that older adults who don't qualify for Medicaid and don't qualify for housing subsidy, how can we provide the supports that they need? We can think about those transition zones outside of villages, about reforming zoning to allow for some gentle density. This is that missing middle that you have probably heard about, 4 to 8 units, 4 to 12 units that can add needed housing options. We often think about zoning. We just did some work at my office on building code, and it's very remarkable how much the building code is shaping the kind of multifamily building that we're seeing on the ground. That sort of 4 or 5 story over retail idea is not an accident, and it's sort of what make the building code enables to pencil out for the developer, but we can advocate for changes to that code that would facilitate the development of some more of these middle options. And we can also consider how to support these middle income projects or housing units within mixed income. Again, Cambridge, Boston, they have middle income rental programs. They have inclusionary for that. I would say addressing housing costs is a really tough problem because a lot of it is beyond us, right? It's tied to land costs, to construction materials, to labor costs, to interest rates, not much of which we can control. We do have a lot of control over the regulatory framework, though, and that includes where we allow multifamily housing and other types of housing options, what we require of it, the kind of processes we require it to go through to be approved. And a lot of scholarship has made this point that local regulations can really affect the cost of housing beyond what we see resulting from these other external factors that we have little control over. I'm an urban planner. I have worked in Newton as a city planner. I understand that all of these regulations and zoning are trying to do a lot of positive things in many cases. And and they're important. But to not change and to not consider how to change some of this, I think, is to doom ourselves or even our future selves who want to stay here in our older years. Massachusetts is one of the most highly regulated places in the entire country. And so I think thinking about what we might do to tweak our planning and our zoning processes to allow for more of these housing options is really a critical part of this.
All right. And so this is the final piece of our presentation, and then we're going to open this up for conversation. In addition to talking about the kind of local and development side, and in particular the things that we can do at a local level with zoning and inclusionary zoning and development policy that is key to the supply side and key to creating an environment that makes naturally occurring affordable housing more possible through density. There's an awful lot we can do on the subsidy side and the government side as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about state and federal policy and ways that we can collaborate to improve the programs, to bring more affordability to everybody who's underserved. So the first one that's, I think, incredibly exciting, and I think it's safe to talk about it here tonight, that in, 7 days now, hopefully we'll have a president that can move her proposed program forward to actually have Medicare start paying for some home care services. That would be amazing, right? Because you're understanding home care, it is health care. And by doing more upstream prevention, by providing home care that can lead to better health outcomes, we're going to save money on the Medicare side, and people are going to have more dignity of choice because that Medicare travels with them to whatever housing option they choose and can help them bridge that gap in affordability on the home care side. So I think that is the most hopeful, most amazing thing that's come around in a long time. I'm really excited about that. For extremely low-income folks, further expanding the mass rental voucher program, which is our state, if you know about it, it's our state version of Section 8, pairing mass rental voucher program vouchers with the other subsidies we use to build the housing is what brings that cost down. So without it, we're building those apartments with $1,800 rents, which is better than market rent, but it's still not affordable enough for the population we're all talking about tonight. You've got to layer on MRVP or Section 8 to bring it down to the vast majority of older adults who can't afford that $1,800 a month rent. We've dramatically increased the MRVP budget in the last 10 to 15 years. Largely, it's followed the family homelessness crisis, as it should, as a tool to try to get people out of shelter, but continuing to expand that supply and creating dedicated resources for seniors to access that in housing that we develop would be amazing. There's also an opportunity within the housing subsidy world on the low-income housing tax credit program, which is the primary driver of affordable housing production. But again, it's those $1,800 rents that just don't work for seniors. Well, the apartments are also only 650 square feet. So if you're a senior who owns a home and has a little bit of equity, but you have fixed Social Security income, you can actually qualify for LIHTC housing because LIHTC only calculates 0.02% of your assets added to your income to be eligible. So the vast majority of people are actually eligible for, seniors are eligible for LIHTC housing, but that's not what they choose. They don't choose to go from a 1,600 square foot house to a 650 square foot apartment. So why not create an innovative LIHTC program for seniors where the apartments can be a little bigger? Bring the product to the population. That starts to reach that middle in a really interesting way where we can use the MRVPs to reach folks who are lower. So some LIHTC innovation would be great. There's a federal program called the 202. It's what 2 Life used to build the vast majority of the housing we have at Bill Coleman House and Golda Meir House, which are right here in Newton. And the program was shelved during sequestration, and it's crawling back really slowly, and we need to advocate to strengthen it and put more money there. We could create a lot more deeply affordable housing with that federal program, which is dedicated for seniors. Looking at Medicaid waivers for sliding scale support on long-term services and supports. Again, we love the Medicare solution, but if we can't get that, let's at least have Medicaid expand the population that it will help. Another great upstream prevention that combines housing and care in a way that keeps people out of those nursing homes. Because a nursing home costs $170,000 a year for Medicaid to pay for, and the state pays half of that bill. It's a shared expense with the federal government. But we know through calculation of an all-in cost of a supportive housing community like the ones that 2 Life operates, and there's other ones all around the state, it's about $25,000, $30,000 a year. To do everything, the housing, the care, the supports, all of it, huge savings to support people where they want to be, not where they're forced to go for economic reasons into a nursing home. More intergenerational options, more creativity around that intentionality. Jennifer has leaned into that and worked internationally on some really interesting intentional intergenerational options. So advocating to get those into our suite of programs that will facilitate and fund in the state. And then finally, we really need to work on more creative ways to help older adults put their home equity to work in better ways. It's what the Opus model does. Happy to talk about that more tonight or another time if you want, but the key is finding ways for people to access that trapped asset, which we both want to put to work for them on the housing side, put to work for them on their care side, and if we're really creative about it, it's also a way to help people save that equity and not spend it down unnecessarily, because that's really key to intergenerational wealth creation and preservation as well. And I think in particular as a community, as we're talking about more wealth creation for Black and brown folks and focusing on creating home ownership and getting people into the opportunity to generate home equity, if we don't think about the back end and better ways to help people preserve that wealth that they've built up in their home, we're not really meeting the full need. So I think there's some really creative options. In our Opus community, we actually have 6 apartments that we have a sort of quiet government partner that's piloting, kind of like a soft second. Do people know what the soft second is? It's when you buy a house as a first-time home buyer, the government will come in and help you pay the upfront down payment. And it's for families that are buying their first home. Well, in Opus, we have a soft second program, but it's on the upfront fee side. So if you don't have enough home equity to afford Opus, we can use this little pool of funds we got to bridge their equity purchase to get those costs even lower. And that's a really shallow subsidy and a really simple way to let the private market, which Opus is almost entirely privately financed, subsidized with a very simple little transaction that can bring that cost down. So those are just some creative ideas, and we need to keep thinking about that, particularly because that home equity is such a rich housing resource that we can put to work to help move the entire system. So we're going to stop there. We've thrown a lot out at you, and give it back for conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. And yeah, we will open this up now. If people have questions, I will move around the room and let you talk into the mic and ask a question. All right.
Could you say a little bit more about what I think you described as some sort of inclusionary zoning that would apply to the missing middle slice of housing? Because that's not what we have in Newton. And Newton is actually in the process of doing a review of our IZ ordinance. And so that sounds like a very interesting idea that should be put on the table.
Yeah, other communities do set aside in their inclusionary, it's never just the middle. You know, there's a certain amount that need to be available to people with low incomes, extremely low incomes. But generally that 80 to 120% of area median income, and that it is a feature of Boston's program. It's Cambridge also has a middle income renter program where they incentivize it through zoning, through the inclusionary, and it may involve some bonuses, some density bonuses, some additional units or additional height in some cases in some cities, but it is something that they're trying, and I think could be, again, this is a universal challenge, the middle income groups across the country. So a lot of creative things happening, I think, in that space.
And I'll just add 2 points. One is to just pay attention, so to the incomes and what that means, because the problem is for 80 to 120% of median for an older adult, that's someone with a lot of equity, right? I mean, if your income is just Social Security and you're maxing out, it's 40,000. So to get to, 60% of median for a single person is 50,000. So that's giving you a sense of how high you have to get to that 80 to 120. So I think it's also paying attention to who the older adult demographic is and perhaps looking at other provisions in an inclusionary zoning law that get to lower incomes for the older adults. And and the other thing that I have to say that we did in Newton that I think is pretty groundbreaking and something we really want to protect is our inclusionary zoning ordinance says that if you're building in a elder housing with services category, if you're getting permitted under that, you actually have to consider the cost of services in your replication, that the intention isn't just housing, but it's supportive housing, and including if they opt for the buyout and to not do the units on site, the buyout has to include the cost to replace the housing, but also the cost to replace the services that weren't provided, that were part of the intentionality of that project. So we've actually looked here at there have been a couple potential buyouts of assisted living that would generate tremendous resource on the care side that could actually come back into the city as a way to generate more senior housing or more supports for people who are low and in the middle. So I think always thinking about the economics and the demographic and how we bring it low enough to affect them and the cost of care and making sure we're always policing both is really key to any IZ ordinance.
I'm going to read some of the questions from the folks on Zoom. One person worried that people who try to stay at home forever are kidding themselves, and they worry this is a social challenge that we have. And they're wondering about policy approaches that can help that social challenge of people trying to stay in their home longer than perhaps they should.
One thing I just keep coming back to is we need options for them to move to, right? So there's a lot of dialogue out there in the senior housing world about aging in place, and a lot of it is predicated on surveys that ask people, how important is it for you to stay in your home as long as possible? They don't say, how important is it for you to stay in your home if you need help? They don't ask you what you're thinking your alternative might be. It might be that you're thinking, hey, yeah, I don't want to be in a nursing home. It's very important that I stay here. But I think that this skews the conversation. If we had many more options, if people had more knowledge of those options and a little energy around and excitement around maybe pushing for some of them, you might hear some different answers to those questions. I really truly believe that a lot of people who are aging in place are actually stuck in place.
We first?
I saw this one on one slide. It said tree house, and I was wondering what that is because I never heard of it.
So it's a community that Two Life Communities, where I work, is in the process of making happen in Mattapan right now. We're replicating a community that's been in East Hampton for 15 years. And the Treehouse Foundation is an organization that's working on innovations in the foster care system and really looks at community living or this co-housing model as a way to benefit older adults and families and youth and kids who have all experienced foster care trauma in the foster care system. So it's an intentional co-housing model that really disrupts that trauma through creating intergenerational extended families living together.
It's usually got services, and if you're interested in the model, it's based, the first one was called Hope Meadows in Illinois, I think, and Bridge Meadows is out in Oregon and Seattle, I think, now too. So,
and Treehouse Village is in East Hampton, and they love visitors, and
yeah, it's a great model.
Yeah.
We have one attendee who is struggling and feeling a little bit abandoned by the city. They don't feel like the $850 a year for Newton at Home is giving them what they necessarily need. they've been searching unsuccessfully for affordable housing that's toxin and fragrance free for people with chemical sensitivities. And they've been struggling to find affordable caregivers for themselves. And yeah, they said they felt abandoned by the city. I don't know if there's a question in there, but I wonder if you have a response.
Yeah, it's a sadly all too familiar story. And I think, you know, there are a lot of wonderful people at the Newton Senior Center in particular, and, you know, who help people navigate, help people understand their options. There's also an organization called Springwell, which is our local aging service access point, and they're also a really fabulous organization. It's a state program that provides housing search and placement, care navigation, you know, helps people understand their options and connect people to services. So, I mean, I could recommend those two options, but you know, sadly, as Jennifer said, we have, you know, both a lot of gaps in our policy and in our policies about how we do this, and we have a tremendous shortage of supply. So we really need to think about how we beef up our supply. And, you know, it's not for nothing that building 1 and 2 bedroom apartments that require less parking costs less. It has a lower development impact, and creating those options and those choices for people to leave their home and move into a place where they would feel dignity and feel that choice is also going to free up options on the housing side as well. It's much more expensive and impactful to build family housing. So coming up with a way to also see that this as a market solution and a way to help our market move and free up options for folks on the, you know, family side who also don't have options is another really important thing that you know, so it's a long-term solution. It's not an immediate solution, but we need to beef up supply in a really strategic way.
Yeah, and I would only add that I think accessing information is a real challenge, right? Especially when these systems are so separate and the information on the healthcare and the information on the housing is often found in different places. If I could wave a magic wand, it would be to create some kind of navigator that it makes it much easier for family members, for older adults to figure this out. The National Council on Aging, which is ncoa.org, has a benefits checkup, which is kind of a cool website if you are wondering if you might qualify for certain things. But in terms of finding those local options and sort of putting the pieces together, I think that's an area where we could really do a lot of good work.
You know, and I'll also just say, start early, right? People wait. They wait till they're desperate. And then when they're desperate, they end up having to make quick, hard choices if those choices are even available to them. And so, you know, as much also it's changing the way we think about this. So people start to think about, how do I start to prepare myself? How do I line up these options? How do I make a choice that's going to be good for me? And the way to do that is to do it before you get into a crisis and before you're desperate.
Hi there.
Hello.
Given the lack of so many affordable housing opportunities for elders, I'm wondering if there are models where communities come together and pool their resources and try to get care for neighborhoods. And it seems to me, I remember reading something about this in Beacon Hill, where
The village
neighbors came
movement?
together. And it seems to me, before we could build all the housing we need, there are many of us who might need those services, and it seems like the city could put some money into having a care coordinator who works with neighborhoods to pool resources.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you think about that. Has it been done? Can we do it?
I think I think we need it all. They're all great options. And again, I would just underscore, anytime you think about any of these options, you have to not only think about who's going to coordinate it, but how are people going to afford it? And so I think just continuing to think about not only the coordination, but coming up with a creative way to use economies of scale to get the care costs down. Because, one of the innovations with our Opus community is you only have to buy half an hour of care. You're still paying privately, but if you need an hour, you buy an hour. If you need a half an hour, you buy a half an hour. if you buy it at home and you're part of a village movement, you're going to be buying 4 hours if you just need half an hour. So finding a way to, negotiating a contract with a home care company, it also makes those home care jobs better. They're really hard jobs. They're isolating jobs, and people navigating those relationships also need support because there's a lot of stress on all sides in that situation. And so I think village movements also can create ways to improve the jobs and the job quality for the caregivers and bring the costs down. So, yeah.
Thinking about the barbell graph you had with the 4 different income levels, do we have a calculation or an estimate for how many units we need at each one of those different income levels in Newton specifically?
There was the 2016 elderly house. There was a study done in 2016. We could look back at that was specifically looking at senior housing. I just can't remember what it said, but I don't think we know exactly. I know we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, you'd have to take out, you have to look at your housing options, and then you'd have to look specifically for older adults, and you'd have to also, all of those studies that do that, the supply gaps, they also have to look at who is occupying housing that is not in their income tier, so to speak. So, those studies are fairly complicated, but it would be a useful tool to have.
Thank you. One thing that I've been thinking about as a former member of zoning and planning and still working on the city council and still concerned about affordability for housing, in Nonantum, there's large areas of manufacturing, some of it large parking lots and areas that, since we weren't successful in getting village center zoning in Nonantum or Newton Corner. However, there are opportunities, I think, and we have to also think about market rate housing as part of it too, of course. But it's opportunities for multi-family with smaller units, which by nature are more affordable, in a walkable village center like Nonantum, where people can stay in the community they grew up in and free up their larger homes for families, which we need for our new schools. So that's one of the things that I've been looking at, and I know there's been some resistance to multifamily housing, but a lot of that resistance, I think, is people are upset about very expensive housing, what we're getting. These 4,000 square foot units that go for $1.5 million, replacing sometimes what people call naturally more affordable homes, and there's something to be said about that. But however, if we can now, not easier said than done, but work on our combination of zoning and cooperation with builders and developers for building these areas where we have smaller units and have intergenerational living as well, because that's really another way to go with in terms of the loneliness factor and isolation. And I think by keeping people in the city, having them move from their larger homes to affordable units where they actually have places where they can walk easily to get to. They're not relying on their car. And that's part of self-care too, being able to walk or go to a yoga class or meeting friends in the park. I'd really like to see something done in some of those I call underutilized areas, and that's been my focus.
I mean, I love those ideas. I think some of the most inspiring examples I've seen in Europe actually are senior housing that's part of a community hub. So they have a school nearby, or they have a preschool, they have a daycare on site, they have a cafe that people of all ages frequent during the day. I could totally see that in Nonantum, and that would be very, very exciting. And I think finding the right developer who wants to do that, finding reduced cost land to perhaps make that a little bit more possible. I think those things are really possible. And I'm glad you raised multi-generational households. So we've been talking about intergenerational buildings where people of all ages live in their own apartments, but somehow have a community life, like at Treehouse. But we're seeing 1 in 5 older adults in this country is living in some kind of multi-generational household, under one roof. And so housing options for them too is important. And that may not be a 1 or a 2 bedroom, right? That may be actually a larger unit. But that in those cases that care is happening within that family unit. So we need all of it. As Elizabeth said, this is not there's no one silver bullet, but I personally have been very, very inspired by these intergenerational campus kind of things where you have multiple uses, and even if the building itself is dedicated to older adults.
This is a national problem, as you've said. From your experiences, are there places, cities, communities that have found a way to come together, everything from the regulation to the community location to the services, and what qualities are there in those cities and in the leadership of them? I'm not talking about a big city. I'm sure a big city has small things, but it seems that these are happening. You alluded to a few of them, and I think we would benefit from some best practices and talking to people who have actually done it, because I think it's something that takes a little bit of everything.
Yeah, talking to cities that are not in the U.S., I have been impressed, and then I learned, oh, right, you have universal long-term care insurance. Oh, right. I think the cities that are moving on these, they are able to present a collective vision that people can get excited about. I think coalitions help, right? So a lot of the things that we're talking about also help with climate and energy. They also help with younger people. They also help with equity and making our community a more welcoming place for more people. So I think those coalitions are really important to build, and that's what's happening here in Newton.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's the age-friendly city movement, and I'm right. Newton is an age-friendly city, and Boston is, and Cambridge, and I think we're actually also an age-friendly state. So I think and I fully agree with you. We need to be doing more. We need to talk about this. We need to educate about this, and at the heart of it, on the housing side, it's the issue of cost, and it's the issue of access. Right, the vast majority of our housing stock in this state is old, and it's not accessible, it's not adaptable. So really looking at ways, the cost problem, the building cost problem is just simply hard. And addressing supply is hugely important to changing the pressures on the market that drive up that cost, and we've got to pair that with subsidies also to bridge that gap where even if we can bring the cost down, we're also making it accessible to a broad range of people through good policy on the subsidy side. So I think it's awareness, it's activism, it's thinking about infrastructure, programs and services across the board, and really on the housing side, we need to lean into both supply and policy to subsidize. We're never going to build our way out of it, but we will help, and we can't subsidize our way out of it either. We've got to really do both.
I'm very interested in the Opus concept, but I would love to see something near a village center that was walkable. I'm wondering, is it land cost or regulatory barriers, or both that are keeping that from happening?
Well, wouldn't you just love to see Opus on that parking lot in Newton Center? Just saying. So it's not regulation. There's finding land that where the zoning can support, or through a special permit or zoning, or 40B, you can make it work. But it's an unregulated model. So it's something that we created. It's a new model, and it is a matter of finding land that supports, it needs scale, because a big part of the model is scale to create community living and connection and social opportunity, but also scale is what brings our care partner on site to sell that care in very small increments. It's volunteerism, the scale of that. So it's finding the right site. We agree, walkable village center. We like to say, if you can't walk out the door and buy an ice cream cone, your community better be big enough that there's a big enough creation of community that you can enjoy that ice cream cone with others. But being in a village is hugely important. And unfortunately, that's where the land is also most expensive. So it's ultimately a cost problem more than anything.
Hi, my name is Jason Shapiro from Auburndale. I live in Waltham, and I just want to briefly share my experience on this topic and offer to help anyone that needs it. So my parents lived in the house I grew up in for 45 years, and my mom still lives there. My dad recently had to go to assisted living, then the ER. He's now at the rehab center at Newbridge in Dedham, receiving palliative care. He has Parkinson's, dementia, he's legally blind, so I have extensive experience with assistive technology for vision, dexterity and movement issues. I also happen to have experience myself with vision issues. I actually had to have cataract surgery last spring of last year. So I can help you with the name of a top-notch ophthalmologist/surgeon, glasses for people with cataracts, post-cataract, and other eye conditions. If you go to www.noir, that's like noir, but it's no IR, like no infrared, noirinsight.com. They have guide on that. And then some show and tell. I actually have my cataract lens implant cards on me. I paid extra for better lenses. So I have 20/20 distance, intermediate, and can get by without reading glasses. Yeah, I'm enjoying the temporarily unemployed lifestyle right now. So if you want to reach me, just talk to me. You can email me at gangofidiots@icloud.com. That's gangofidiots@icloud.com. It's a Mad Magazine reference. I don't have an actual gang of idiots, but some of my friends might join up. So yeah. Just wanted to share.
Thanks. I think, this will be our last question, and then we'll close up.
So can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay. I really love the idea of having someplace people can go like Shine, in Massachusetts, and learn more about what the housing opportunities are. Because a big question I've had, I actually live in Coleman House, and I wish I had known more, because I knew it 20 years ago and it's very different now. And I love the Opus model, but I feel like if you own a home and you have the equity for a home, that's where you're in one level of housing. Mm-hmm. If you no longer own your home, or like me, I moved here from North Carolina from working at Duke. So I came from a situation where my income wasn't that high, and I'm going to say something that's not politically correct, but Coleman House is now predominantly Russian, and the people have Russian daycare, Russian services, they have each other, they don't speak English around the building, it's very lonely and it's very isolating. And I wonder why, it used to be a lot of really professional men and women who, it was a different demographic. And if I could speak to someone or someone like me to find out, okay, what really matters to you? And, because I think the income level is mid-50s. So it's not really low. If most people on Social Security are making in the 20s, and you're saying some people 13. So where do you go? It's kind of the donut hole of housing. Where do you go then? Mm-hmm. And there are so many people in that situation who don't have any place to go. So I wish there was someone to talk to about that, so.
Come
thank you.
talk to me after.
I'm going to.
Yeah, good. It's nice to meet you. Are you one of our new residents, or? Yeah.
I also have to just give a shout out to Lizbeth and To Life, because they're a national example. When I go to national conferences, we're talking about To Life, and Opus is a beginning. I hope there are many, many more iterations of it. You know, To Life is doing what a lot of places are trying to do. Yeah.
Great. So that is all the time that we have for tonight. Before we go, I want to take a moment to thank Lizbeth and Jen. You guys have been so wonderful. Thank you both so much. We appreciate all you guys do to help seniors and the housing and cause in general. I want to thank Dennis Milligan for helping us out on Zoom, and Congregation Dorshay Tzedek for hosting us. Lastly, if you enjoyed this event and want to hear about more events, you can sign up with the QR code or list outside. We have one coming up on November 19th, specifically about affordable housing in the city of Newton, which every single person on the city council will tell you is a big deal, and yet we don't have enough of it. What's up with that? We'll talk about it November 19th. And we'll be having more events like this in 2025 on workforce housing, the connection between housing and the environment, and the role that affordability can play with market rate housing. But again, thank you so much for coming, and have a good night.